that we are recording this event, we have muted you all. And the irony of us muting you because we don't trust you to do it yourself is not lost on me, but we do encourage you to engage with the discussion. Please post your questions in the chat and we'll put them to our panelists to hear their thoughts. And the session will run for an hour and a half. First up, we'll hear about some of the findings from our project on trust and the information ecosystems around COVID-19. We'll follow with a discussion amongst the panel, and we've allocated a generous amount of time for questions from the audience. So please do share those in the chat. So thank you again to everyone who's joined us. A special thank you to those who may be up late, early, or eating a meal while we chat. And now over to my colleague, Stijn Elbers.
Hi, everyone. My turn to present the research that we have done throughout the course of the project, Rooted in Trust. I'll start by sharing my screen. And then we'll go through that. I would like to say that the project was called Rooted in Trust. I would like to add that our research also is very much rooted in reality. We're not only a research organization, we actually want to get stuff done as true humanitarians. So while we have done 7 information ecosystem assessments where we try to investigate what are the dynamics between the people that we are trying to support with better information and the different options they have available of accessing that information. The findings and the insights are also based on all of the work that we have done alongside the research across 7 countries, 12 languages, working with 30 odd partners, producing a lot of rumor analysis based on a lot more community data. So that is a little bit what we're going to look at right now. What are the insights that we have gained working in those communities on misinformation, which of course is an indicator of trust. And this is a little bit the methodological overview of what we look at when we talk about information ecosystem assessment. We've done 7, like I said before. We did qualitative and quantitative research, but it's fair to say that a lot of it is really grounded in qualitative research. We've done surveys, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, tackling all of those different elements that are impacting the information ecosystem that we're operating in. Broadly, we could speak of the supply side, the information, the channels, the sources that are available, and the demand side, what are the information needs that people have. But obviously, it is a dynamic between those two. It's not just about a transaction, it is about the trust, the preferences, the influences that are impacting the behavior of people, the likelihood that they will like it, believe it, share it once they are exposed to it. First insight that I would like to share is basically trying to unpack what we mean by trust. And I think it has definitely come, like very high on the agenda of humanitarians. Lots of people are talking about it. A lot more research is being done lately, and that's really interesting. And I think we still use it as a sort of container term that means a lot of different things. And if we really unpack it, like some of the elements that I think we should not confuse it with is like reliance and influence. For instance, like if we look at the graph that is now on your screen, you could see that people rely on certain channels. That doesn't necessarily mean they trust it, right? They will rely on channels because that's what's available, and what is good enough will help them through the day, through the week, through the year, even when they're not 100% sure if it's really trustworthy. Another element that is often like used almost interchangeably with trust is influence. For instance, a lot of community leaders will have influence That doesn't necessarily mean that they're trusted on all aspects of life. For instance, if there is a new pandemic, a new epidemic in the community that turns out to be a pandemic, do people trust their community leaders with the information that they have at hand related to that pandemic? These are some of the elements that I think, if we're going forward, we have to probably be a little bit more accurate about when we talk about it. Talking about accuracy, obviously accuracy matters and facts matter. We wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be Internews if we wouldn't believe in the power of facts, but it's not enough, right? If we look at the trusted sources, if we ask people who they trust, like what you see in front of you is from our information ecosystem assessment in Mali. And yes, local health community health workers are on #1, and that is like somewhat reassuring because they combine both that like knowledge about the situation and they're in the communities. Second are the religious leaders, and there already you could wonder, like, do these people have access to the latest information related to the pandemic? And yeah, international media comes third. Which again is kind of an interesting element and indicating that while the facts might matter, you do have to embed it in a sort of contextual understanding. International media might have a lot of facts, but one could wonder how relevant they are in the context that people are receiving those facts. And you see a French quote from our French language information ecosystem assessment in Mali, where one of the elements that are being surfaced through all of our IEAs is that it might be factually correct, but if it's in a language people don't understand, it might still be lost on people. Similarly, like if you look at the quote on the left-hand side, which comes from our research in Lebanon, you can be right, you can be factually correct about the information that you're sharing, but if it's not really locally applicable, you kind of come across as tone deaf. Which is why acknowledgement matters. Acknowledgement is, of course, that includes listening, that includes like making things contextually relevant. It also means that, like, while we are all focusing on one particular problem that we're funded to focus on, we ignore a lot of other aspects of people's lives, right? The quote on the left-hand side comes from our research in Colombia, where people say, like, I'm going to die of hunger before I die of COVID-19. Now, that's maybe putting it a little bit stark, but more importantly, I think, reveals the frustration that people feel when we get so single-minded and single-focused in our communication that everything else gets pushed aside. And that might feel tone deaf. And then your factual, accurate information might still be lost on people because they feel like you're not fully understanding their context, their reality, their plight. So acknowledgement will always have to be one element of your communication. Another one is proximity. And while that might seem obvious, and I think across humanitarian agencies, we've all understood that we need to improve our localization, that we have to rely on locally available channels, that we have to build on locally available structures. But if only it were so simple, right? When we talk to refugees, migrants in Colombia, not only do they suffer from xenophobia, and it means that while locally, there are structures in place, they might not fully trust it because it's embedded in xenophobia. Also, we looked particularly in the LGBTQI community among the refugees in Colombia, and it might not need a lot of empathy to understand that for people who are not necessarily comfortable in sharing their sexual identity with, let's say, grassroots organizations who might not be all sympathetic towards it, that they might not rely on those locally available resources. And I think one of the elements that we worked on in Rooted in Trust, and one of the elements that I think is important, is sort of the juxtaposition between, yes, of course, we have to work with local communities, we have to listen to them, acknowledge them, build on existing structures, yet we have to make sure that they also then are like well connected with the reliable, accurate information that is contextualized, so that those existing structures are also providing the information that people need. You see on the slide that there's both a reliance on it and a trust in local structures, as well as distrust. And that's not a contradiction. On certain topics, people might actually prefer like expertise that comes from outside their community. That doesn't mean that we don't have to work with it. It probably means that we have to connect them better. And then, you know, like this is something that also shines through all of our research. That, you know, you can build trust, but once it's lost, it's really hard to rebuild. And that actually emphasizes the importance of trust and being very mindful when we are working, you know, across the world, across communities. Once it's lost, it's hard to rebuild. Like, for instance, and that's coming from our research in Central African Republic, we, like, you know, no institution, not the international aid workers, not the national government, not local community leaders, except religious leaders, get a little bit more than half of the people's trust, but most of them score a lot less. And that means it's like a society that has, you know, over the years, like suffered through conflicts and political crisis. There's a general distrust, and this example comes from Central African Republic, but I think when people don't feel acknowledged, when people don't feel that the institutions have done a good job at serving them and helping them, when a pandemic strikes, when a crisis strikes, people are, of course, going to be skeptical, even when maybe the information shared through those same institutions this time around might be accurate and might even be locally relevant. The distrust will undermine it. And yes, that is a bit of a long game when it's lost, and it's definitely also not that easy to win. I think overall, these are 5 of the insights that I wanted to share based on our research, a bit as food for thought and food for the discussion that is following after. I would like to summarize with the idea that we should look carefully in those different elements of trust. And while I think sometimes they are at odds with each other, like, you know, like we need to respect privacy on one hand, but the same privacy might feel like secrecy to others. And we need to also address some level of transparency. Both is important for trust. They are at odds. And while that might mean that we never can get it 100% right for everybody, I do think that our research, and I think all of our experiences across the world where we work, show that we can get it wrong. And I think the basis of this discussion should be like, how do we get the balance a little bit more towards a workable, trustworthy relationship with the communities that we serve. Over to you, Irene.
Great, thank you so much. I hope that was definitely food for thought to get your brains working on this topic. I'm now going to introduce our 4 wonderful panelists that are joining us to dissect this question. And I'm going to start by getting them to declare just briefly which side of the fence they sit for the question, do humanitarians trust people? Indu Nepal is a community engagement advisor at ICRC. She has extensive experience working at the intersection of accountability, engagement, advocacy, and technology in development and humanitarian settings. She's also a co-founder of Body and Data, an organization working in technology and gender, and Hackogram, a collective working on the design of digital technologies for rural settings. So, Indu, where do you stand? Do humanitarians trust people?
Thanks, Irene. I think, as you said earlier, the dichotomy of us, the humanitarian, and the people I don't think it reflects the complexity of any community or society where we work. There's a network of trust relationships in any community. Sometimes family members don't trust each other. They don't trust their neighbors. And how we work in this trust economy is an act of conscious positioning. It's also very contextual. And as Stein said, it's a long-term process and it has its ups and downs. I came to work for the ICRC because of his work for the families of the missing. At the time in Nepal, I was involved in a project collecting testimonials from the families who had been missing since the conflict in Nepal. And one of the questions that we'd ask them was about, who they went to and what help did they receive. And what kept coming up in these interactions was that their interaction with the ICRC, they said they listened to us. They didn't blame us. They didn't blame our sons or brothers or sisters. They didn't stop us at the gates. They listened and they asked questions about us. And in the end, what they did was they asked how I was going to get home and if I had a place to stay in town. And I think I say this because it's important to say that the process of building trust begins with this act of being present and listening to people's stories. And it's an incredibly equal and dignified interaction. And of course, we can't be naive, and I'm not going to be naive. And we have to nuance that by pointing out that while there are excellent examples of how this works on a micro level, I think where this gets complex is how do you apply this systematically and consistently across an organization, or you want to make it even more complicated, you think about how you can apply this across the system. I think some of these are issues as simple as people behaving in a savior way, being lazy or what have you. But I think bigger issue perhaps is not so much a question of how trust gets demonstrated through individual engagement or working with partner organizations, etc. But I think Ben said in a previous conversation, it's also a question of will. And I think that's a question about system change. That's a much, much bigger question than individual engagement interaction with a community or a group of people.
So there's a very solid start to proceedings. Thank you, Indu, and we'll come back and unpack a lot of that very quickly. Salma Amin is a marketing professional in the field of media and broadcast and the co-founder of Anderia, an online cultural platform serving Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and expanding into East Africa. Anderia is also one of our wonderful local partners in the Rooted in Trust project, leading our work to collect, analyse and respond to COVID-19 rumours in Sudan. And Salma, it goes without saying, but of course I'll say it, that as a local organisation that often partners with international organisations to do your work, I encourage you to be thoroughly critical of those relationships where you choose, including our own. We can take it. So the question of the day, do humanitarians trust people?
Hi everyone. So I think with the trust issues, there is an issue with trust, and this is like being faced on a macro level across all industries, not only like with humanitarians, and especially we're faced with it critically in the media field. So I'd say in terms of like working with humanitarians and so on, and having several international partners as we implement our work in Sudan and beyond, we can't say there is a trust. I think it is something that we need to continue building and working on, and just constantly to try to improve. And and a lot of these interesting insights that came up from Satan's research. We actually did we've faced a lot of these things on ground, and also on other issues that we were working on. So
Great, thank
you. I think trust is something that's a work in progress and needs to be worked on, definitely.
For sure, for sure. And our third panelist is Ben Parker. He's now the senior editor of the New Humanitarian. Ben has been in humanitarian affairs and online media for more than 25 years. His last jobs in the UN before moving to work in independent journalism were as Director of Communications in Mogadishu and Head of Humanitarian Affairs Office in Syria. Welcome, Ben. After your years of analysis, where do you fall? Do humanitarians trust people?
Well, I'm going to be difficult and spoil your question, because I don't think they need to, and I think that's a greater problem. I think there's a deficit of accountability, and which allows, if we call them conventional humanitarian operators, not to need to trust their clients, and to be unaffected when their clients mistrust them. So I would say trust would be icing on the cake, but before you get there, you need some legitimacy, and you need some competence, and you need some accountability. When you do things wrong, or you disappoint your client base, or you fail them, there ought to be consequences. I don't particularly like my bank. I think they're probably evil at some level, but I think they're competent. I don't really see it as a relationship of trust when you're dealing with a service provider. And I think we need these harder basics before we move to the softer values.
I look forward to unpacking that. That's really interesting. And let me introduce our final panelist so we can start to unpack these wonderful ideas. Our final panelist is Lael Banham, and she's the program manager at Maharat Foundation in Lebanon. She has more than 10 years experience in the fields of media development, community engagement, freedom of expression, internet freedom, human rights, and through Maharat leads advocacy actions to reform the media ecosystem in Lebanon. And the Maharat Foundation is a wonderful partner of ours. They're leading our work to collect, analyse and respond to COVID-19 rumours shared among Syrian refugee populations in Lebanon. So lucky last, Lael, do you think that humanitarians trust people?
Thank you, Irene, for this introduction, and thank you for hosting us in this great panel. I would like to say that information providers, including humanitarians and the media, are still using, like, based on all the work that we've been doing in Rooted in Trust and in general in monitoring the media in Lebanon and also engaging with communities. So we still see that information providers in general are still using top-down, one-way communication style, if I can say. So I can cite an example of an introduction of a media bulletin of a leading mainstream TV that was shaming people that were not abiding by the lockdown, calling them with no brain. So this was an introduction that went viral all across the media and among communities, and it definitely didn't help. So trust should be definitely mutual, and communication should be two ways. Information providers need to speak the language of the people, use their channels, listen to them, and take the context as well into consideration so that people can take informed decisions accordingly.
Lael, let me ask a follow-up question to you, because you're at the end of the queue. So let's start with you. I mean, one thing that our research showed is that in Lebanon, the community doesn't necessarily trust humanitarians at all, especially the bigger NGOs, because they're in and out with funding cycles. They're not necessarily reliable. They're much more likely to trust the smaller Syrian-led NGOs that have been there for a longer amount of time. If the community doesn't trust us, should we respect that opinion and get the hint and direct more funding to these local organizations?
Definitely there's an issue of trust in Lebanon, not just among the Syrian refugees, but as well among Lebanese citizens. And also we have Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So, and currently, like, most of the people are, like, more than 60% of the people are beyond the poverty line due to the economic crisis that we're facing currently. So it's not just COVID, it's a complete failed state that is not being able to respond to any of the needs of the communities, both Lebanese, Syrians, and Palestinians. And this definitely puts like more burden on the trust issue, including the international organizations and WHO. Everything in Lebanon is politicized. So also, when we talk about like a minister of information that is like affiliated with a certain political access, if you want, because it's also about access in Lebanon. So we have the Iranian, Russian, Chinese access, and the Western access with Saudi Arabia, etc. So it's a divided community. We are in a divided country, so everything is politicized, even when it comes to the vaccines. So people would trust either the Russian or the Chinese vaccine because they are from this axis, let's say. People will trust more European, let's say, vaccines because they are from another political axis. So this really puts a lot of burden on international organizations and people, including refugees. They have a lot of needs. So since the Lebanese government and the state is a failed state and not being able to provide any services, this role has all the burden has come on the civil society, including NGOs, who are not being able maybe to fulfill all the needs of people, because there's a huge demand. And of course, international organizations would not be able to fulfill all these demands. And this creates as well another issue of trust on how these aids are distributed. People saying that, why should I trust? Would they support all the communities? Would they equally? How aids are provided, etc. And this definitely decreases trust. The trust goes, yes, to local organizations or to international organizations working on the field with these communities, building these relations. So there are like two ways, either trying to build more in-person physical relations, even with the COVID situation, or like working more with local entities and community leaders. Like in the presentation, we've seen that how much trust is in the community itself. So people trust their friends, they are in these social closed groups of WhatsApp, of Facebook. They trust the neighbor, what they would, the neighbor, what he or she will say. So there are like, when we talk about the way forward, so there are a lot of ways to build this trust, either by engaging more with local communities that are considered as gatekeepers, if you want. So working more with these community members and leaders, enhancing their media information literacy skills maybe, and working with them to act as these mediators or providers of information on behalf of these international organizations. It would be one way, definitely.
Well, I mean, you said there about community engagement, and Indu, your role is really focusing on engaging with the community and building stronger structures there, making sure we understand their needs and their preferences. Do you think we do a good job at putting all of that listening that we're doing into action?
Sorry, just finding my unmute button.
It's okay.
I actually also want to go to a point that Ben made earlier, which is about, do humanitarian organizations require trust? And I think just to sort of position this as what the representative of a humanitarian organization here, I think for the ICRC, I also want to sort of share that the work that we do is not primarily just of an assistance or a service provider. Our mandate is to sort of protect and assist people affected by armed conflict, of which aid is one of the tools that we use, or assistance is one of the tools we use. And I think just to sort of say that, I think there is sort of a question of if you don't have trust, then you really don't have anything, because in a lot of places where we work, these are insecure contexts that are based, and we primarily work based on acceptance of our mandate and organization, and building trust is a first step to even being present in a particular context. And I think just on the work around community engagement, I think the challenges, I would say, in my work is on a super micro level, is to work with our colleagues to really sort of instill this a particular mindset with the way of working. I think what we've tried to do in order to help colleagues apply this systematically, and I think this is where the challenge is we've tried to put a frame around it. It's a framework that then has outputs and outcomes and impact. And I think there is sort of a danger. It's also like turning this into a output-based work, because at the end of the day, if people, you can put as much, I think there's like way of just justifying this. For example, you could sort of say, oh, I talked to X number of people, but what is the quality of that interaction? What is the process like? And I think where we are right now in terms of our work is we're actually not paying attention so much to the quality of those interactions, but actually going after a numbers game, I would say. And I think that's also a particular way. It might also, dare I say, a Western academic approach to work, where you need data and you need evidence, and you need to have a perfectly edited report before it counts as that evidence, and maybe someone does something with it. And I think that's sort of like a balance that I feel that we have to sort of take in our work. It's like the balance between process and the result.
And I think that's a really good point, because when we're looking at who we're talking to or who we're listening to in a community, I think perhaps the first step of community engagement for many organizations is to say, we will go to the community leaders and we will hear what they have to say. And of course, it's important to have them in the mix, but sometimes the listening doesn't go past the leader. And I think we all know that, quite often in many communities, a leader is, more than often more, older, generally in a privileged position. That's generally how they found themselves in leadership. Are we, reinforcing privilege by consistently going to the leader and asking them what they think, and perhaps, sometimes not working hard enough to make sure that we do listen to some of the quieter voices in a community?
I think the job of a journalist is to listen and to reflect what one finds. And certainly we try to distinguish our journalism from the less high quality journalism, in our view, is by the voices you choose and the way you present them, and the opportunity for the reader to some extent participate, in the sense that the reader can make their own sense of the facts and the interviews and the voices put before them. So the act of consuming journalism is a judgment experience, and I guess it does involve trust, because if you think I'm going to make it up, you're not going to read it. Hopefully, if you don't think I'm going to read it up, then you can then say, well, you've chosen too many men, or you've only reflected foreigners, or you don't think of this aspect. And that's a healthy, I think, hopefully occasionally a two-way street. I think we can say from some of our experience in news gathering, I think is transferable somewhat to the work of humanitarian agencies. I just want to say in relation to the previous speakers, Indu and others, trust on its own, I don't get the point, right? Why I don't trust for what, right? Surely the point is that trust in order to save people's lives in terms of their health behaviors, or trust so that you can reach people and help them. I mean, trust on its own, I don't see why that benefits anybody for Action contre la faim to be trusted by so-and-so in the Central African Republic. It's meaningless. So I think, again, I'm going to the pragmatic level. So my example of journalism, we will always try to, we at the bottom of all our articles internally, we count how many men, how many women, how many international, how many local, how many, and whether or not we've used a local source who can't be named, and we need to acknowledge that, but protect their identity. Modern journalism is actually building now trust metrics so that we can judge each other, we can judge ourselves. And I think, again, answering your question earlier, Irene, and it's mentioned in the research, listening is not enough. If you are a service provider and you're trying to gain trust, listening is not enough, because if you don't change on the result of what you hear, then it is lip service. I don't know what the opposite of lip service, ear service, and without any result. And I think that's insulting to your client. And in fact, it's worse than doing nothing. Sorry, that was but it's a two-way street, and you need to have metrics of what you're meaning to achieve.
And earlier you gave the example of your bank, and maybe not necessarily liking them or thinking that they're the best of people in the world, but then still therefore entrusting your money with them and hoping that they'll do the right thing. And I think when we're looking at trust, financial accountability is one of those regular arenas where trust in local partners is raised. The common line is, we can't fund the local partner directly, they won't be able to manage the cash. Do you think that argument sticks, Ben?
Well, we interviewed the head of the European Union's Humanitarian Department last week, and he said it, which we found, and many of our readers found, quite surprising, because that argument was meant to have been put to bed a long time ago. The international agencies are perfectly capable of stealing and wasting money on a gigantic scale. I think that's a fact. And the opportunities and the space granted to local, indigenous, grassroots, and even medium-sized southern big NGOs has never been a fair playing field. So surely especially in the task of health education, to be international is already a handicap, right? You don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the background, you don't know how you're going to put your foot in it. So I would say the argument, especially in communication as aid, is not why localize, it's like why not de-internationalize?
Let me go over to Salma and make sure she has space for a chat, because Salma, the organization you work for, Andaria, you're a media and culture organization. And I think when we're thinking about does a humanitarian system trust communities, local media is a part of that. Local media is very much of the community, and they're there to hopefully represent the views and defend the community as well. And hopefully also there to hold the humanitarian response accountable. Tell us about your relationships with humanitarian organizations. Do you feel that media fits into that picture?
So with our positioning as as an independent media organization in Sudan, and how we serve information to our audiences, especially post the revolution, we think people are quite receptive to information, and especially that if you keep that impartiality and being away from being categorized under any political allegiances or so, that makes a room for us to be heard and to be trusted and not to be so much under the spotlight. Now, working with humanitarians and international NGOs, it has been, I think the key challenge is that they come with a mindset and an outlook on how things should be implemented, and hey, this is the manual, go ahead and do it. But then the context on ground is very different. And for instance, if we have a topic, say COVID-19 or the vaccines and so on, and it is something that we want to serve to our audiences, we want to produce and so on. But then you have the realities on ground, Sudan is a country of competing disasters. People are constantly spending 3 or 4 hours in the line just to get a bread or filling their gas up. So having such coming from a perspective where you only want to prioritize this catastrophe or this topic gives people hey, you guys are so disconnected, you don't know what's happening in my life, I'm just going to scroll out and not really engage into this. Another thing I want to highlight, that you mentioned an interesting point about leaders and how they're supposedly trusted and the opinion leaders in whatever tribe or area that they are in. One of the things that we've faced during our Rooted in Trust when we went and met with vulnerable communities in Darfur and other cities in Sudan, is that the youth were actually very upset that we had to go and gain, just to get the clearance from the tribe leader or the area chief to come and meet them. So they were very critical, why did you guys go to them and how much did you pay them? And so in a sense, they're refusing this kind of conventional leadership. So in order for us, whether as local partners or humanitarian agencies, to be able to approach these younger audiences or targeted vulnerable groups, we need to change and revise our approach to them, and how this can be addressed obviously through local partners, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who have the upper hands in terms of knowing the local communities, knowing how best to, again, communicate with them and engage them and so on. So I think having such a thing, having a lead role in terms of not only the implementation of the project, but I'll say the strategizing for the project in terms of local implementation in the country being in question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think what we've seen a lot of in this crisis is a lot of funding media to write stories on COVID-19. The Rooted in Trust project has an element of that as well, obviously. And one of the things that our partners in South Sudan told us, it's a similar situation where they said, look, we can't just keep doing stories on COVID-19 because that's what your funding is asking you to do. Because when we incessantly do these stories on COVID-19, which suits your donors' needs, our community thinks that we're pushing a foreign agenda, and we're losing the trust relationship with our community purely by following, this, I guess, project plan that was determined outside of the country, sometimes by people that have never been to the country, you know, and so I think that flexibility to be able to make sure that the local partner has agency in adapting programming is so important.
Yes, that's definitely correct, and also where in different occasions that we think that even the topic of COVID-19 for itself, instance, can be tackled from so many different ways, like just from not a single approach, like the mental health to it, like making fun. I don't know. So many different ideas, but not being so single-minded towards like and so on. So.
Yeah, for sure. And just on the topic of media, Lael, let me go to you. I mean, your organization, Maharat Foundation, really represents so many media in Lebanon, trying to represent their interests and create a free press and make an environment where they can exist. Do you think that humanitarians in general encourage media to, I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but do you think that they encourage media to hold them accountable on behalf of the communities they serve?
Actually, and there's like the media landscape itself has its own problems in Lebanon. So, and like throughout our work in Rooted in Trust, like we engaged a lot with the journalists. There were like many challenges whenever it comes to reporting on COVID-19. So one of the main challenge was that it was a new topic. They did not have already established relations with the humanitarians. We saw on televisions that the television is still a main source of information for people in Lebanon, including refugees. This was like in all the interviews that we did with the refugees. They said that they watch television and they trust the information provided by televisions. Unfortunately, like from all the rumors that we've collected, like from I think 2,400 rumors we've collected in few months, 400 from these rumors were spread by health workers and doctors or influentials, some of them on television and then shared on social media. So whenever you want to engage and talk, we did many engagement and many training as well for journalists. So the first argument would be, okay, doctors on television are spreading these rumors. So if doctors are spreading these rumors, what would be our role? So how to do fact checking, how to fact check, how to go and find reliable sources. And also the language is a barrier. So most of them do not speak English. So, or a lot of journalists do not speak English, and most of the resources and studies are being published first in English. So there was like there was a lack of engagement between journalists and the humanitarians. We tried to tackle this issue and to build these networking opportunities so that journalists could have reliable sources of information whenever they wanted to debunk misinformation. So this was a main challenge. And also another challenge that sometimes we felt that it's not only media. So if we want to talk about Syrian refugees, they don't have their own there are no media platforms dedicated for Syrian refugees. So this is why they were relying on these WhatsApp groups. Everything that they receive, they lack media information literacy skills, so they do not challenge any information they receive. Whatever they receive, they spread and they share without thinking whether this information is accurate or not, and they do not have the skills to do that. And also another challenge is for journalists and the media, how to report on scientific issues when the language used sometimes by humanitarians is complicated and very scientific, whereas people will not understand this language, and most of the time it's not relevant to the context as well. So media turns to a preaching role rather than like preaching people that you should stay indoor, you should not go out, rather than looking at the whole context and seeing that people do not have money, they have to work, they have to go out, they have to. So what? No one. We did not feel that communicate that. Yani, they were not equipped. Media was not equipped to think about strategically about communication risks. So how to deliver an information that is relevant to the context, economic, political, social, etc. We did not see that because they lacked the skills, and they lacked as well the engagement and networking with the humanitarians who at the beginning were not as well doing the same effort of engaging with the media to spread. So they were like just, okay, issuing statements, putting things on their websites, but okay, so you need to do more than that. So this was like the role that we tried to play, bringing journalists and like putting them in contact with doctors who are really reliable, who are like aware of the most recent studies, so that they ask them questions, they understand. Even we did a session on vaccines, because a lot of rumors were spread around, like vaccines transforming our DNA. So journalists could not respond to this rumor because they did not have the scientific knowledge on how to address this issue. Okay, when we read like these scientific papers, people will not understand. So when you talk about the difference between messenger and DNA, etc. So we try to build these connections, to put journalists together with the experts, so that they try to simplify this information for the journalists to be able to spread them again throughout their work.
So I think when we're talking about this issue of trust and whether humanitarians trust people, it sounds like from the four panelists that we're really talking about relationships. We're talking a lot about respect. And I think especially from what you said, Ben, we're talking about perhaps do humanitarians respect the communities they work with? We're talking about the relationships between humanitarians and media, humanitarians and the community themselves. With this situation that we've described over the last, 30 minutes to 45 minutes, what do we do about it? How do we fix this situation? What would be the one big thing that we could do to help improve the situation and to build a more trusting, perhaps balanced relationship between these groups? Let me start perhaps with you, Salma. What do you think we can do? How do we fix this?
I think the first thing to fix or change anything is starting with ourselves, whether as local partners or as humanitarians and so on. First, that we really need to address is how we look at these communities and vulnerable groups. For instance, when we come to say just hold an engagement session or a workshop on COVID-19 and so on. I want to give a real example with the tea ladies communities. Basically, tea ladies in Sudan, they're mainly IDPs just coming to. So you would assume they don't know much, they are highly misinformed and so on. So this is the perception that everyone thinks, but in reality, when we went and had this session with them, these ladies were very informed. They were asking very tough questions. We had a doctor training them and so on. So he was actually very impressed with these questions. So the way we think is that we need to level up, that people are not really that misinformed, or they're not really that illiterate. They actually have access to information. The way we have to do is we have to level up in terms of our delivery, our engagement, and the way we design our projects. That's that in terms of working with the communities. And then the second thing when it comes to working with international NGO as a local partner and as a media organization, again, I think I'm not saying that NGOs and international should mindlessly trust local partners, but I think after doing a very good vetting and having a strong portfolio and so on, I think they should let them take the lead in terms of the designing of the project, really applying the context and integrating several elements to kind of lead them into how to best maneuver this country or the situation. And in terms of I know the reality of this can be very, very difficult, as timelines and so on and pre-approvals and so on, it's very difficult. But again, having a real effort and putting so much thought into that will help slowly rechange the dynamics of the relationship, and then and that overall will give the best results, whether for the humanitarian or the local partners in terms of achieving the goals of the project and so on.
Yeah, so definitely moving to a model that's less prescriptive and more collaborative in designing the project, and actually working with the capacities of the local organization and the wealth of knowledge that they likely have. That's great. Thanks, Salma. Indu, what about you? Do you have a silver bullet or $1 million idea that could solve this problem?
Oh, I'm sitting on so many silver bullets now. I think going back to my earlier point, I think it's really in my work anyway, with what we try to do to whoever will listen is being really intentional about the process and interrogating why you're there, if you're best person to be there. And I think also really sort of focusing on the process as much as you sort of, might focus on the outcome. I think just to sort of give an example in the ICRC, something that we've been working on this year quite a lot, primarily to sort of help our colleagues deal with this remote work issue during COVID-19, but also other sort of access challenges, was to sort of put hotlines in a few places. And someone said, it's great this is great. We have a hotline. We know that another organization in a certain context, they receive 100,000 calls a month, and that's a fantastic indicator of success and how great we are at engaging with communities. And I think this is where I had to sort of take a pause and say, like, well, it's great that you're accessible and people can reach you. That's fantastic. But you're receiving that many calls a month, then maybe there's a fundamental problem that you're actually not listening to people in the first place and designing programs that are not really good in the first place. So better, measure would of course be course correction, what happened with those calls. And hopefully you would actually have a number of calls that were sort of consistent, but not, so you would have to do something. And I think it's just what we need to do is sort of, think about what we're doing with everything, like and how we are reflecting constantly, who we're talking to, what we're missing, and what we're doing to actually act on what we're listening to. Otherwise, I think we just sort of count in a vanity matrix and think we're listening to people.
Yeah, 100%. And if you're getting thousands of calls, does anyone have the capacity to genuinely respond to all of those questions and complaints and concerns properly? Or as you said, is it just going in a spreadsheet and then into a report and then off we go? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thanks, Indu. And I wanted to pass the baton over to Lael. What's your solution to this issue? I think in the last discussion, you brought up a few really interesting ideas there, but what do you think would be the silver bullet or the $1 million idea or the one big thing that might be able to fix some of these problems?
Yeah, I think for us all, humanitarians, media, and civil society, I think it's not just listening. So building on what have been said before, so acting, not just listening, acting accordingly. And as well, I will give an example on something concrete that we were able to do, and we felt that it was successful somehow. So because we were like looking at the vulnerable communities and like detecting and listening to what kind of rumors are spreading in this within these communities. So we tried like to access some WhatsApp groups led by community leaders or led by community members, or people who are spreading information among the community, taking these rumors and trying to debunk misinformation, or like to highlight facts rather than rumors, and spreading them back into the same groups. So this was how we acted after listening. So we listened what were the misinformation spread, and then we tried to go back to the same groups where the information were spread or these rumors were spread, to try to a bit like challenge or change the perception. And what we noticed actually was that these like admins of these WhatsApp groups stopped sharing like a huge amount of rumors. So they were like even sending to our social monitors before sharing in the social in the WhatsApp groups for the communities. So they felt they have a reference now. So they were turning to our social monitors who were and asking them, do you think I share this information? Can you check if it's true or not? So, and this was successful. So I think if we all joined efforts to really listen and act accordingly in order to provide relevant information for people to take informed decision to save their health or to know about the services provided by different like groups and the humanitarians, it would be a great thing. And of course, media information literacy is something very important. We should invest more in media information literacy, not only with the communities, but you would be surprised that journalists even do not have the skills to do fact checking, even though we're not talking about using technology, even we're just talking about cross-checking information and going to reliable sources. Even this skill is not always does not exist always. So more capacity building for journalists, more media information literacy, more acting when listening, through disseminating through the same channels where these rumors are being spread. I think we can do something if we like work like accordingly.
Fantastic. And do you think there might be benefit in also those media literacy courses also being given to humanitarians to better understand, I guess, the role of media and where they fit into a humanitarian response?
Yeah, I think it's very important, Irene, to mention that, because always in all our projects, we feel that even experts, they need to know how media works. They need to understand media in order to be able, let's say, when we talk about like understanding the media, it means understanding that they need to act fast. So they have only one day to do the reportage, let's say, to be disseminated on television. So you have to be on there, like to act quickly and to give them the information like right away, not just tell them, okay, I'll see my agenda if I can fit this interview in this week. So sometimes we have this as journalists. So in everything we do, so we feel sometimes that experts do not understand the work of the nature of the work of journalism. So maybe as well for humanitarians, it would be good to listen from journalists on what are the conditions of work when I have 2 or 3 reports to finish in one day. So it would be beneficial for them to understand the nature of my work so that they can respond accordingly.
And I have to apologize, that was a terribly leading question, but thank you for asking it, Lael. And of course, Ben, let me go to you. Do you have a solution to this trust challenge, or to the challenges you noted before, that humanitarians don't seem to mind if there's trust or not?
Well, I think I'd respond on the question of what do we expect from journalists and what do we expect from media and what is beyond their world. And I think we've had this debate internally. We are a non-profit news service specialized in humanitarian affairs, but we're not an advocate. We don't join campaigns. We don't say this is bad, this is good. We present the facts as we see them. Yes, we choose and select and steer our coverage to things that appear important to our editorial judgment, but we're not advocates. And a lot of our donors want us to be, right? They want us to educate or to push the needle or to take a view. And we have a lot of conversations with donors about editorial independence. And if you are an advocate, that actually reduces your independence and the trust that your reader has in you. So some of the things that we're talking about today sound to me that we are asking journalists to be public health communicators. And I don't think that's right. And they're clearly not very good at it, whether you look at London or Dar es Salaam or Florida. Journalists are probably not your best avenue to the public imagination, given the explosion of technology. I think there's my magic bullet is that there's a whole world out there of positive propaganda that is a new field. And if you look at QAnon and you look at the rise of Trump and the alt-right in the US, there's skills and techniques and influence ops that are being run under our noses, and we're here doing like fact-checking. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. I think positive propaganda is a different skill from journalism, and I think some of what we're asking journalists should be done by different people, advertising people, political campaign people, and experts in influence.
It's almost behavior change journalism that you're describing there, where there's a very solid idea of what the content should be and how it should be expressed.
I think it's campaigning. I don't think it's journalism.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me open it up to the floor. I did say that the audience would have lots of chances to ask questions, and the doors are widely flung open. So please do, if you do have a question for any of our 4 panelists or for all of our 4 panelists, please do put the question in the chat box and we will pose it to them, and we will work them a little bit harder for another half an hour to see what else we can squeeze out of this issue. So we have a question that's come from Lisa Rudnick, and this was actually a question for all of the panelists, so do feel free to jump in, whoever is feeling especially excited about this one. But this is a question for everyone. Do you think this problem of trust makes humanitarians vulnerable in any way? For example, to misinformation in their operational environment? So I put that out to the floor. Would anyone in the panel like to jump on that one? And I'll repeat the question again. So the question was, do you think this problem of trust makes humanitarians vulnerable in any way? That's fine. Maybe not that question then. Ben, yeah, go for it.
To take that one, yes, I think some NGOs have already started having kind of counter misinformation focal points in their teams. Because if you look at the overlap between the security agenda and NGO work, certainly going back to the Americans in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the use of polio teams to give cover to the assassination of Osama bin Laden, there are elements in which the work of NGOs is already easily comes under suspicion, and repressive regimes are very quick to allege that foreign NGOs are operating for enemy forces. So misinformation is, I think, part of the risk profile. I think it is a maturing of the NGO risk analysis, is that people are out to get you. And MSF, for example, was attacked during the dispute between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, I think, as being taking sides, and we've had evidence of bot campaigns on Twitter and so on. So I think misinformation is already a threat to NGOs and their staff.
Yeah, for sure, and especially if you look at the increase in attacks on health workers in the field since the start of COVID as well, and a lot of that driven by misinformation. So yeah, for sure. We do have another question that's come in from Musa Dumbia, and he's asking, does the lack of trust make communities unreceptive to the aid they actually need badly? So I guess the question there is, if humanitarians don't trust the community, are they likely to not want to take aid from us? I guess I'll put that one to Indu. I'll call you out.
That's a very interesting question. I think there are sort of multiple sort of prongs to that. Just going back to the this point, piggybacking on what Ben said and what I spoke about. I think not if you don't have trust, for us anyway, it's a first step to whether a sort of a analysis of whether we can be in a particular place or not. We've also sort of have examples of where, we perhaps got a bit complacent, thinking that communities and other actors understand our role, understand what we're doing, understand the programs that are sort of operating in a particular place. And that, we've also had incidents where that trust has broken down and resulted in security incidents, and we've had to build up. I think just to sort of give an example, in one time in Afghanistan, when this happened, we went back and talked to a lot of people in the community, and we actually found out people didn't understand our programs and did not know why we're there. And I think this was a little bit of a shock to our colleagues, which then had to then sort of, work on building that trust again. And that required a lot of legwork. It required a lot of sessions of like sitting down with various community members, leaders, and I think all the sort of different just like from authorities to all the way down to the community level to sort of really have that conversation and to answer questions. And so it has impact on what we can do. It has impact on who we can reach. It has impact on, how we can best work with the community. And I think all of that is sort of like links to, what we're able to do. Now, has there been sort of explicit refusal of assistance that's sort of been provided? I think that one is quite, I would say, actually quite hard to measure, but it's also sort of how to measure negative is quite hard. So if people don't come to us, with the specific complaints or the specific feedback saying that, it's actually quite sort of hard to measure and sort of say, yes, this has happened. But, I'm sure there are examples of where people have refused assistance for X, Y, and Z reasons.
And actually, Indu, there's a question. Oh, sorry, Lyle, go for it.
I can just add like a small note here, like in Lebanon, for example, I can give the example of Lebanon. I don't think that people would refuse the aid. There is a bad need for aids, but what would lack of trust would affect is the information. So if they do not trust humanitarians or international organizations, they do not trust the information, the health information provided to them. But for the aids, they will take the aids because they will say the aids are there if it was about any services provided. So we should make the difference between the service provided as aids or the information provided. So I think that the lack of trust affects the information, but not the service or the aids.
If I may add to the lady's point, I think apart from the communities itself, also the gatekeepers, those persons who are in charge to whether distribute this aid or actually allowing something into the country. If there is a distrust in a certain organization, it will be almost impossible, even if the people were like initially receptive to it. But like in our own experiences, we find it very hard for people to accept anything, whether it's information, aid, whatever that is, to come actually on ground if they don't trust the organization where it's coming from. So at the end of the day, the lack of trust really presents a real challenge for humanitarians and the way where they want to work, and if they really want to be a part of a community's engagement and development into the future.
Yeah, well, I think we're definitely talking about, in a way, two different issues here. We're talking about, does the community, trust the humanitarians that are working with them? Less so than does the humanitarian organizations trust the communities that they're working with. I think if you're, providing aid to a community and they don't trust you, there is a chance that they won't take it. If you think of the vaccine as being a form of aid, if the community does not trust your organization and it's your organization's job to distribute and to inject people with a vaccine, I think we've seen in many examples in many different countries around the world that people just simply won't accept it. Obviously, it's a slightly different question if we're talking about food or things that people have less of a choice around. We have a question to Ben that's coming from Rosie Jackson as well. Ben, early in the discussion you said that trust wasn't important or critical, and she's asking if trust isn't the barrier to improved value in the relationship between humanitarians and communities, what is?
I don't think it's not important, but I think the way the incentives and the power economy of international aid works, the trust is not a necessity for the program to go forward or the services to be offered. And failure is also does not result necessarily in the withdrawal or the reduction of that organizational influence. So I was being provocative. I think you can build trust through being accountable. My point was you can build trust by being legitimate, and that covers a range of things, of diversity, of inclusion, of decision making, and so on, of being competent, and thirdly, of having some opening yourself and your organization up to some sort of consequence, regulatory discipline. I would add a fourth. As a journalist, I would say transparency. Tell us what you're up to. Show us your books. Show us your budget. So my argument was that trust is a nice to have, but the way the system is set up, it's not a requirement, and that's I think not a good state to be in. But it's perhaps one way of looking at the problems, that you can trust can be a bonus if you achieve these other four things.
Would one way to address, this trust relationship, I think at the end of all of our projects, we generally write a glowing report saying how wonderful we are, and we submit it to our donor. We show our donor, this is why we feel we've done a really great job. Would it make a difference if humanitarian organizations were really pushed to have the community evaluate their work rather than ourselves evaluating our work or having the donor evaluate our work? I'll put that out to the whole panel.
TripAdvisor.
Exactly. Give me a Google review.
I think a 360 evaluation of the work or the project that being implemented would really give the best results, whether project is going to be ongoing, or just to give a reflective picture of the reality of how the project was implemented and so on, whether the communities, the local partners, the media, and so on. So I think, again, like a 360 approach into reporting these results or experiences or engagement on grounds, that would make, I think, that will have a really real impact in enriching the project deliverables or the overall results.
I guess then the challenge is, if the community assesses us and says we're doing a terrible job, what next? Does the community get to kick us out? I
could also actually add to this. One of the, do you want to go, Ben?
So go for it.
In relation to the work that we do with the families of the missing, this is actually a sort of a question that's come up quite a lot in our reflection, because the outcome of the results, would be actually positive solution in terms of finding answers for the families whose members have gone missing. And that's a core component of our work we do, but we also know that there are a lot of factors outside of our control, because we may not be able to give that positive outcome for people. So I think we're sort of like, we cannot promise, a X number of case resolution, because there's so many factors involved, but could we then evaluate the process of how that happens? And I think and that part is very much sort of evaluated by people who actually take part in the services. And I think that's a really interesting reflection that we're having internally, and like whether we can apply that lesson to other programmings that are just much more geared towards providing services or cash or goods. But this is a reflection that we're having internally.
Go for it, Leah.
Yeah, if I can add a point here, making the communities evaluate us. Definitely, it's relevant, but sometimes I can give the example of the Beirut explosion. Sometimes the needs are very, very high that no local or international community can fulfill. And this, when you start listening to people that we did not get enough help, so this would be their response. But it's not because the local community, the humanitarians or local or international organizations did not do their work or did not provide enough services, but because they could not fulfill enough services. And when, let's say, all the aids were centralized in Beirut, because it was like where the explosion happened, where the damage happened, where people were injured, out of their homes destroyed, etc. But if you go outside Beirut in the Bekaa or the north or etc., you would see more needs that no one was looking at, because there was like another priority. So if you ask people, they would say they are not happy with the intervention, for example, of the civil society organizations or the international organizations. So just this point on related to how much we are able to fulfill the needs of our communities when we are in crisis at multiple levels.
Is some of that around transparency, though? If we're really transparent with our communities about what we can and can't achieve and how we operate and how things really, expectation management, does that work to address some of those challenges, though?
Here we go back to the trust issue. So how much would they trust that we are providing them with the accurate information related to how much we received and how we're spending the money received and the funds? And it happened a lot. So there's always this issue of trust again that rises. And sometimes it's justifiable, because we cannot say that all the organizations are transparent and are not spending money are not as well corrupt, if you want to say. So this goes back to the question of trust.
There have been a few questions that have happened in the chat around trust and how long it takes to build trust. So when we're looking at humanitarians trusting the community, so maybe it's humanitarians trusting the crisis affected community, humanitarians trusting local partners, humanitarians trusting local media to also do their job. Does trust take time? Is that legitimate to say that trust is going to take a while for humanitarians to give? Feel free to take your time to answer this one. Go, Salma.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that if the positioning was right since the beginning, if people or humanitarians, our local partners, position themselves in the right space, using the, for instance, like people who are not very prejudiced or so on. If things were approached since the get-go in the right approach, I think it will be slightly easier and will take a lot less time. And also a lot of it is when you enter, like say, a new market or so on, the community itself, what pre-existing misconceptions that they have, how can you already, as a humanitarian organization, how can you avoid it? who do you want to be the face of it, and so on. I think bearing in mind how you really like first approach them will spare you so much time and trouble within the communities you're trying to approach, and also will be easily to build trust and influence within these communities.
Ben, I saw you nodding there. Did you want to respond to this one?
I just want to say I really agreed with Leo's point that if you ask people whether they got enough, you won't find anybody who ever says they got enough. But I still think it's legitimate to compare: is the clinic run by Save the Children better than the clinic run by the Lebanese Red Cross, for example? You could have a survey mentality for that. On the question of trust, I think you need to be. I think it's less positive because it can go down as well as up. We did a series of stories in Eastern DRC which revealed that there was a huge breakdown in trust on both sides. The community had learned how to cheat the system in a massive and long-running fraud that we exposed thanks to investigations run by the NGO Mercy Corps, where the people would make up fake beneficiaries, people would fill in the right boxes on the right forms, the NGO staff were complicit, everybody went home with money in their pockets. So they had learned, they didn't care that they were cheating these organizations that claimed to do good. And they had learned how to, this particular subset of the community had learned how to cheat them. On the other hand, the aid community bullied people in their time of despair when their relatives had died and started pushing them and shoving them and telling them how to bury the body and bringing the police to the funeral. And unsurprisingly, the blowback was violent. So I would say you can't count on your trust growing over time, and you can blow it and you can go backwards as well as forwards, and it goes both ways. If your recipient client community have been abused and neglected for long enough, they'll cheat you in a heartbeat. I would too, and I don't think that's really a matter of trust. It's a matter of survival.
We have a question here that has come in from Ahad Ali, which says that it seems like trust is being talked about in this highly conceptual manner, especially given its situational, contextual, dynamic dimensions. So just to ground trust as an idea, as a graspable item for measurement and self-assessment, how would the panelists recommend evaluations or measurements of an idea like trust? How do we measure if humanitarians trust people? It's hard. I mean, I think from the other side, we do a lot of community surveys and perception surveys, and we ask communities, do you trust us? Or who do you trust for information? We do a lot of asking of who people trust. But how do we measure from our side whether we're actually having a trusting relationship and giving what we get?
I can answer maybe by evaluating what changed after listening. So what was the action taken after listening? So evaluating what has changed, let's say, in the way humanitarian works.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Salma.
I think when it comes to tracking sentiments like trust and so on, I think the best practice is to do it is pre and post and implement a project and so on. Obviously, if there is a budget for it, but I think through quantitative and qualitative research, we can measure trust and like brand desirability, how people often like tune into you when they want to find out information. Do they follow you? Would they recommend you to someone? And recommendation is actually a very good indication to measure trust. So such research can really help quantify trust in a community between also and how much they trust a humanitarian agency and so on, if it's implemented over a period of time with the same, obviously, objects and so on.
I think that's a good way of measuring, whether the community trusts the humanitarian agency. But Salma, again, pointing to you as a local partner, and what for you would show you that you were trusted by your international NGO or by your donor? What are the signs or the things that you might measure as a local partner to see that you had a trusting relationship? Just putting you on the spot.
I think it is like many relationships. I think trust grow in time. So with the frequent communication, with the success in implementing a project and so on, and with the like, for instance, if you completed a project successfully, you're awarded another one. So that shows a lot of trust, and also. And again, a recommendation being recommended to somebody else, that means you're somebody who's credible and trustable and trustable. So I think these things is a good indicator for us as a local partner that we're being trusted by humanitarians.
What do you think, Indu? How do we measure whether we trust the communities we're working with?
I think the best way, is I think all the colleagues have said, is actually sort of, it may be quite hard to measure the conceptual thing as trust itself, but you can, I think, measure how trust is demonstrated. And that could be in terms of what did you do with the information that was shared with you, how are you working with local partners, etc. And I think there's also, you know, other sort of things that we talked about, which is like questions around access, questions around what you're able to do. So I think you may not be able to, I think just again thinking about this, I think there is ways to measure the demonstration of trust. And even some of these perception surveys actually do ask that question, which is, you know, do you feel your views are taken into account when people make decisions, for example? And I think when you sort of triangulate this information, you might be able to get to something that sort of allows us to measure trust.
Thank you. Ben, what do you think at the New Humanitarian? Are you interested in developing a trust matrix to help us out?
Hell no. We struggle to prove our impact, and I think in the sense that it is an overlapping problem. I don't have any clever ideas beyond what the panel has said. I agree, all of those could work and should be tried. But yeah, our donors and our board and our team, we wonder what difference we make. And I think at the end of the day, if you're trusted and you're making no difference, then you're just like nice. I don't think that's really a value. So I think it came up earlier. What difference did you make is the end of the value chain, as it were. I would look for, we see now that audience surveys are becoming a more common part of humanitarian aid. The group called Ground Truth Solutions is paid by NGOs to go and ask, but what we don't get is the name and shame of each organization compared to each other. It's like, do you trust the organization? Do they listen to you? Do they respect you? Do they take your views into account? Those sort of questions are now coming, and I think the donors can have a positive influence on demanding that in terms of public accountability.
I mean, you're right that a lot of those questions are now being asked, and Ground Truth Solutions do fantastic work. How much are we sharing that information, though, back with the communities? I feel like that research happens and it's fascinating, and we bring it to our coordination meetings and we all have a chat about it, and we take it back to our boardrooms or our virtual boardrooms in COVID times. We all have a chat about it. Does the community ever get to hear about what was said? You know, information is power.
Well, I mean, the more radical is democracy, is representation on boards, and community leaders having a say, having a vote, having a seat in the management committee. I think that speaks to local domestic politics, really, as a potential healthy influence on humanitarian aid, but often it's populated by negative people and negative values, and therefore you wouldn't want them. So I don't have an answer at all to that. But popular speech and feedback, yes, should be part of it.
Indu, I mean, your role is very much around community engagement. Can community engagement play a stronger role in sharing all of this research and these community perceptions that we ask of the community? Can people in these kinds of roles also play a role in delivering that back?
Absolutely. And I think, again, I would go back to my original point. I think there are some good examples of where we do this. This may not happen just in terms of the measurement or barometer of trust itself, but it will probably happen from a range of sort of perspective of looking at programming broadly, I would say. But more and more, and this is, our organization is definitely making investment in this, which is by putting resources around it, working with colleagues to sort of really help them build their communication skills, for example. And I think there is sort of at the ground level, again, there's like excellent examples of how we do. There's also from a programmatic perspective, some programs do this really well. I think the main challenge is sort of scaling this out across the organization and across perhaps the system.
An excellent point to end on. And thank you, Indu, and thank you to all of our panelists today and to our audience for all of their insightful questions. This is really a big issue and one that we're certainly not going to solve in an hour and a half, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about it, talking about it, and putting in place actions to try and address some of the challenges that have been raised today. We'll be sending the recording to everyone who registered, and we'll also have it and the research on trust mentioned earlier by Steen Elbers on the Internews website in the coming days. Don't worry, we'll send you the link. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy your day or your night wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much.